Here we go. Hey everybody, and welcome to the Ruby Rogues podcast. This week on our panel we have Dave Carmona.
How's it going?
Brian Hogan.
Hello.
I'm Charles Max Wood from devchat.tv, and this week we're going to be talking about what do you do when you run into WTFs?
Dear Ruby developer, are you sick and tired of working on crappy old legacy code bases? There's got to be a better way. If you want to get a better job, here's what you can do. Find a technology that's really in demand, build a side project using that technology, and then use that side project as experience to get your next better job. I've done this myself several times. It definitely works. What I think is a really good technology to learn right now is Angular. Angular is really in demand right now, and it's not going away anytime soon. I have a free guide to getting started with Angular and Rails at angularonrails.com/rr. Good luck and enjoy this episode of Ruby Rogues.
Now, I'm going to kind of get this started because this was something we talked about as a potential topic a couple weeks ago. And I'm wondering, when we talk about WTFs, are we talking about WTFs as in code we don't understand, or WTFs as in, why am I getting this error I don't understand and I'm really frustrated about it?
I think both are, valid directions because, especially if you've kind of written the code. I'm not sure if you ever written Perl, but Perl's not meant to be read. It's meant to be written. And,
Oh, that's mean. Also true, but mean.
I've
no, mean is JavaScript.
I've written some stuff in Perl. I'm like, as the author of it, you should be able to understand what you wrote.
No, there's an assumption for you.
Yeah. But in Perl, that just wasn't the case. So, a year later, I had to go back and debug something. I'm like, I have no idea what's going on here. But then, there's also some times where I get a syntax error or a logic error, and I'm like, why? What in the world is going on here? And, more often than not, after I give things a first glance, I resort to the Rubber Duck Debugging Method. And for those who don't know, the Rubber Duck Debugging Method is where you have a physical little yellow rubber ducky on your desk, and you talk to it like it's a person. And you explain your issue, what's going on, what's happening, what it should be doing while you're pointing out some code, just like you're kind of doing a little screen share with the rubber ducky. And just the process of explaining it aloud to the duck, you kind of hit that moment of that epiphany where you're like, oh, that's what's going on.
Now it's a fantastic technique, and I sometimes involve people with that. Like, my wife is not a programmer, but she's a pretty technical person. But and I will often have that same kind of discussion with her, just sort of in passing. Like, I'll be away from work and I'll be saying, yeah, I'm just really struggling with this problem at work, and she'll say, hey, tell me about it, and I'll just start talking about it. And in mid sentence, I'll be like, never mind, I got it, and I run and take care of it. I think she probably would prefer I use the duck more, but
I've done that before, and not just with programming problems either, like business issues or people issues, And yeah, it's the same thing, and it's so funny because I'll come down and she's looking at me, and I know she has no clue what I'm talking about. And then all of a sudden, it's like, I got it, and I just run off.
And you occasionally hear in the background, glad I could help.
Yep.
But it is super helpful. I've encountered those problems where you have both of those things are true. Where both of those things are true. You don't understand the code, and also you're getting an error message that you don't understand. I've encountered that more than I care to admit. And usually the culprit is this really terrible programmer named Past Brian, because Past Brian has caused current Brian a lot of frustration. Just with strange things. I don't know. I think that sometimes it's really easy to kind of point the blame at a previous developer. That's Bob's code. Bob he doesn't work here anymore, and you blame it on Bob. But a lot of times, in reality, a lot of times, I think a lot of the problems that programmers encounter really are of their own making. And so Dave, what do you do when you encounter some code you don't understand?
So try to step through each, if we're talking about Ruby, if we're talking about a class that is just really big with a lot of different methods, I think finding the entry point into that class is, usually the first thing. So if it doesn't have your standard initializer, and if it's not really clear with like a call method or something that you kind of point into, I would first try to find the other relevant parts of the application that is calling that to kind of see the entry point. And from there, if things are just really obfuscated, so it's not very clear in plain text, like the method names, if you have a lot of X, Y, Z's, I's, I's, and stuff in there, then that just starts to get really frustrating. But I may start going through and start renaming some of the variables as I identify what they're doing. And then I'm a big fan of puts debugging. So Aaron Patterson had written up a article about that. And I'm like, that really speaks to my heart because that's how I like to debug.
I do that all the time too. That's my first.
I do it constantly. I'm always afraid someone's gonna make yell at me for not using like pry or a proper stepped up or something like that. But like, no, this works, man, and it's faster sometimes. So,
yeah, but
I'm glad I know I'm not alone. That's awesome.
I'm more often than not working in a Ruby on Rails application, and using puts debugging while tailing your development logs is very painful. So I'll sometimes write a separate debugger class that actually logs to a separate file, and then I'll tail that file. So as I'm putting in the puts in there in the application, refreshing the page or whatever, I'll only see the relevant bits of code that I want to see. So that's been a big time saver and helper rather than parsing through ugly logs.
Yeah, I know. Like when I'm working on a Rails application, I'll do. It's not necessarily puts debugging, but I put it in the same category. I will just literally raise whatever object.inspect.
I did that yesterday.
Yeah, I did do it a lot because that's the object I'm looking at. Because you almost all the time in Ruby, for me, the errors I encounter are it's giving me back something I'm not expecting.
Yeah.
And it's one of those things that you'd think, oh yeah, that shouldn't be a problem, but it happens way more often than it should. Why am I getting back that instead of this? Oh, because I programmed it wrong or something. But it is nice to be able to just really quickly inspect that object. And again, sometimes I have the controller file open, or I have the view open already. I guess I could do it a different way, but it's quicker to just type the word raise in front of the thing, and then I get the whole stack. Not only do I get the object, the contents of the object, all displayed out, but I get to see the session and the cookies and everything else all there too. So, it's very old school debugging, not fancy, but sometimes it works really well.
And another thing, if you are working on a Ruby on Rails application, adding the gems to your development group, binding a caller, and better errors, and then binding a caller, those are lifesavers. It's a much more interactive session when a error is raised, that you're able to see where the error has been raised, and then it gives you a console where you're able to type in and start checking things out. And I think the new Rails 5, or I forget when they added in the web console, but I know now, which is the standard Rails error, when it's raised, it also loads a web console that you can kind of tweak things and play around with.
Yeah, I think they put that in Rails 4.
Yeah.
But yeah.
But I'm also a big fan of binding pry. Just when I really need to kind of loop through and try to figure something out, binding pry is really nice. But it's also one of those really annoying things where I often resort to the puts debugging, because if you have a loop of 100 items, binding pry is going to get really annoying if you put yourself right there in the middle of the loop. So, but it's not too bad. So what are some of the craziest errors that you guys have experienced? And
I can volunteer. I can volunteer my most recent one. I spent an hour on this. I've been working with Elixir and Ruby, And the syntax for a few things like declaring methods is pretty similar. The only difference in Elixir is after you specify that the name of the function and your arguments, you put the keyword do, kind of like you would with a Ruby block. Well, if you do that in Ruby, if you define a method like that in Ruby, Ruby's interpreter gives you a relatively difficult to decipher error message that doesn't really have anything to do with the mistake you made. It's a little tricky to figure it out. So if you're not actually looking for what you did wrong, if you don't actually catch it, you might find yourself spending like an hour, like I did, trying to figure it out until someone else looked at my code and said, "Hey, you have a do there, and you're not supposed to have that."
Yeah,
and which is one of those things where getting a second pair of eyes to look at something after you've been staring at it for a while is a really great way to shortcut a lot of the time you spend.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so I'll admit mine that I had last night. It was 2 a.m. and I was still working on a personal project, and I need, it's using Rails 5.1.1, so latest and greatest. And I thought that I had stumbled across a bug in the latest version of Rails with the enumerators of a model. So for the life of me, I could not get it to save the enumerator, even though I had it selected from a dropdown. So my way around debugging was to, launch a Rails 5 new test app, just create a simple scaffold with enumerator, set the value, it saved, I saw the value in the database, we're good. And then I created a Rails 5.1.1 application, just a simple test app, very, very lean, did the exact same thing, and it worked. So I'm like, I did something completely wrong in my application. So luckily for me, at 2 a.m., I'm already exhausted. The first thing I went and checked was the database, and I saw that I had my data type for the enumerator as a string and not a integer. So that's why it was not working right. But that was just got lucky instead of, tracing back throughout the entire application. But that definitely was a frustrating one.
Well, I think it's really interesting the way that you went about debugging that. The whole idea of, hey, I'm going to create another project, a completely new project from scratch. It's kind of a very scientific method. You're creating yourself this nice, clean environment to try to recreate the problem. And it's something that I don't see a lot of developers try first. But a lot of developers that I help, especially junior developers, they'll immediately come and say, hey, can you tell me what's wrong with my code? And that's one of the first things I suggest to them is to say, hey, why don't you try creating a brand new app so that you can eliminate any other dependencies and see if you can recreate the problem there. And if you can, then we got to dig deeper. But if you can't, then you're going to go back. So that's really cool that you use that same approach. I wonder how common that approach is.
Well, if you ever submit a issue to the Rails GitHub repo, I think one of their first things is they ask, hey, can you create a sample application with this error? Or, to reproduce this. So
yeah, I bet that really helps. That probably really helps them, narrow it down, because there could be, hundreds of different conflicting gems at this point and libraries that could be causing the problem.
Or just edge cases that they just didn't think of. So yeah, but honestly, if it's a simple issue like a enumerator and a model, then it's very quick and fast. It took me maybe 2 or 3 minutes to set up each instance of a Rails application with that in there. So I knew it was going to be a very quick and rewarding effort, because it was going to tell me immediately there is a bug in the Rails core or there is not. I'm an idiot or someone else is. So it was a quick test and definitely paid off. Then I was confident. And I think that's what a lot of it is, your level of confidence in where the error could be. Is it in something that I created, or is it in something that someone else created? And then report it to the appropriate team or party. And so at that point, after I created the applications, I was confident that the error is somewhere in my code. And that, really narrowed down where I was able to look.
Yep. I mean, the thing that I was trying to fix last night, so I pushed up a new version of the feed app that I used to build the RSS feeds for the podcasts. And, it's something that I custom built a few years ago. It's still running in Rails 4. And, I'd had another developer working on it, and he'd made some changes, and apparently there was a bug in some of that. And, yeah, I didn't read the error message very well. And so yeah, I just stepped through it with that puts debugging, and I probably should have characterized it with a test, but I didn't. But anyway, it was pretty interesting. Just, okay, it's getting this data. Okay, it's getting that data. All right, so what's the problem then? And it turns out that I was doing a string print time, STRP time, I call it, and I had the wrong format in it. Formatting string was bad. So
Well, that'll get you. I heard you say that you thought you should have characterized it with a test, and that's a technique that I bring on every once in a while too. And I'd like to hear more about how you employ that when you're solving problems.
So generally, if there's some issue in the code, yeah, I like to put a test around it. And in this case, what had happened was, yeah, the format of the date had been not specified quite right. And I'm not sure if the JavaScript library I was using for the date picker had changed, or, what exactly had changed, but it was using dashes instead of slashes. And what I really should have done is I should have just captured what was being sent in, and then, just set up an integration test that quickly verified that it handled that input exactly. Yeah, you can write a really quick test in a lot of those cases. In fact, I probably wouldn't have even needed to parameterize anything. I could have just gotten away with saying, okay, well, here's the module that tells it how to parse dates. And so basically, give it the date, just copy the date string out of the field and then just send it in. But what that does is then it validates my thinking, right? Because especially if I can copy and paste the input parameters, I get a much better idea about what's actually being sent in. And then there's not the chance that I'm typoing it or making an assumption about what's actually being sent. Because a lot of times if I type the input in, then I'll type in, oh, well, this is what it's getting because this is what I think it's getting. And instead, if I can just, copy it, or sometimes you can find tools or you can pull the parameters out of the logs and you can get some really good ideas of, okay, this is what's actually being sent. And I can just, lift the hash, drop it into a capybara test, in Rails, and then just run from there.
Yeah, I was just going to ask you, how you go about getting those. Do you use web console, or do you just go to the log of the running application, or do you, raise an exception or somewhere just to capture the post request?
I've done all of those. Ways.
Yeah,
it just depends on where I'm at that day.
But yeah, there's I found a lot of value in that when I, especially when I'm picking up an app from somebody else and I'm here's a bug, can you investigate this bug? If there isn't a test case for that specific scenario, I've sometimes actually created a test that tries to reproduce the error rather than creating a test that tries to give you the right answer.
Yeah,
I've created a test that reproduces the error, just so I can prove that it's happening, and it's easier for me to do that than it is try to make the app do it. Try to get through the various stages of the app, like logging in, signing up for an account. On the more complicated apps, it can be kind of a chore to do that. So if I create a test case that proves that the error exists, then I sort of can use that to change the code to break that test, and then change the test to fit the code. I'm not sure if anybody else thinks like that, but that's sort of a weird way that my brain works when I'm debugging things.
Sometimes it is easier to approach it from, it should break like this. Yeah, then it should work like this. And so, that makes total sense to me.
Yeah, and a suggestion to the listeners, if you are using something like caching on your production environment, whether you're doing Russian doll caching or any other, the Rails fetch kind of methods, also set that up in your development environment. If you're using Redis or something like that, try to get your development environment to match your production environment as closely as possible, because you may find that some of your caches aren't becoming stale when they should and stuff like that. So I had to debug caching issues, and those are probably one of the most difficult ones to try to figure out what's going on, in my opinion, just because you're expecting one thing and something completely different is happening, and now you have to figure out if it's a caching issue or some other kind of logic issue within your code.
That's a really good point. I mean, I've done this myself. I'll have caching on in production. I just, because I'm doing the development, I don't want the caching to happen in development mode. I'll make sure that it's off, and then I'll find I roll it out in production, and there's there's clearly an error where the caching isn't being expired properly, and it's silly of me to have not run it that way, at least at a staging level. But so I got burned by that a couple of times. Now if as soon as I decide I'm going to use caching, I just I suck it up and it gets turned on in development mode and it stays on the whole time. If I need to clear the cache manually or start things over, that's a CLI command or a script way to just clear everything out. So it's a really good point.
Yeah, and to add on to that, if you're doing your unit tests or feature tests rather with the caching enabled, then you can also use the time cop gem to kind of forward your. It doesn't actually change your system time, but it makes your application think that it's a later time. So when you call like time now or something, it'll return a future time. So you can use time cop to move forward in the future to test to make sure that if you are caching, doing some kind of rush to all caching where maybe you have a blog post and you want to say that this comment was added 2 minutes ago, 3 minutes later, it should say this comment was added 5 minutes ago.
Mm-hmm.
And you can test for stuff like that and make sure that you don't have some kind of caching issue.
That's a really good point.
Yep.
You can tell that I ran into a lot of these things. That's how I know to say them.
So what are your favorite tools? I mean, we've mentioned like better errors and binding of color. We mentioned pry. Are there kind of some go-to tools that you just install right off the bat on a Ruby app or a Rails app or even some other rack-based thing like Hanami or Sinatra or something that you just you use as a go-to for this kind of debugging?
I use Google Chrome a lot. I'm not sure why, but I have a lot of memory on my computer, so I guess it doesn't affect me too much.
Mm-hmm.
But there is a Chrome extension that allows you to. It's basically like having a mini profiler within your development tools of Chrome, but it digs in so much deeper than what mini profiler does. As I talk, I'm trying to find the name of it. Just I can't think of it for the life of me. Do y'all know what I'm talking about? Rails panel. So simple. So
Rails
I'll post
panel.
a link to that.
I've never heard of it.
It's really cool. So it's basically when you are developing, and if you have it running, you do have to add a gem to your development environment, but it gives you a layout of all the requests that are coming through. It shows you the controller in action, things that are getting called, the time it took. It lists out in a nice readable format all the parameters.
Sounds nice.
And then also the active record calls, any kind of rendering or things that are getting cached or logs or errors that are getting posted.
Very cool.
So it's definitely a neat thing.
Oh, that sounds very useful.
This episode is sponsored by Compose.io. Compose is a fully managed database hosting with extra security, scaling, and performance. Hosted on dedicated SSD servers, you can pick from 9 highly available databases: MongoDB, Elasticsearch, Redis. Compose Enterprise comes with easy scaling, which means you can add additional nodes at any time. It's auto-scaled resources like storage, memory, and IOPS, RESTful APIs, central console to manage all your deployments, and premium support with guaranteed response time and priority ticketing. With Compose Enterprise, you can free up your time to focus on building your app instead of managing your database. Check them out at enterprise.compose.com. And if you try Compose, you'll get a free special edition t-shirt. Hurry, quantities are limited. That's enterprise.compose.com.
What about in production? Because a lot of these are things that I guess you could run them in production, but it doesn't seem like a terribly good idea. Do you use like error monitoring or things like that?
Whatever tool is currently available on the project that I can use to capture exceptions.
Mm-hmm.
That might be Airbreaker, it might be an open source alternative to that, but capturing the error messages so that I know. So by the time the user decides to contact me, I already know that it's a problem, and that's so important to the apps that I run. Is just that little bit of that gives me an opportunity to capture as much data as I can, so I can recreate it on a staging environment.
Yeah.
Yep.
And for me, I use a variety of different tools to kind of catch production stuff. So fortunately, but not unfortunately, even for like my site Drift and Ruby, I have several web servers all behind a load balancer. So where the actual error generated from which server, you don't really know. And my servers they're kettle, so I can destroy one and just run a script to recreate new ones as I need. So it's not like it's a persistent error. It would just be something that happens. And I use New Relic, one to capture, just the performance of the application, but they also have an error notification. And the error notification, I have it at a low threshold. So if an error does happen, then it actually sends off to a Slack channel that identifies that, hey, you received this number of errors in this short amount of time. Then because I do have multiple web applications, I can't just pull up a log file and then search for the error because it could be on a different server. So I use Sumo Logic to kind of concatenate and combine all of the logs from the different servers to one manageable place.
I was working on a project once where we were actually using FluentD and shipping the logs off to FluentD so we could do that kind of to aggregate all the logs together. And I that was really cool because it was an environment where we really didn't feel comfortable shipping things off to an external service. But as cool as that is, it's another thing to manage. So I kind of recommend do something like that internally if you have no choice, but use somebody else's service. It will make your life easier if you do. So I want to point that out because there may be some people that are listening and say, well, we can't, management, stakeholder, whatever, doesn't feel comfortable about shipping all of our log data off to somebody else.
Right.
So you can set up things like FluentD or other aggregation tools to ship all your logs off to somewhere else and then do analysis on them.
Yeah, which I really do like Sumo Logic. They do have a free version. However, I think my biggest complaint about them is that the applet that you have to install on each web server, it's a Java-based, and I think it takes, a couple hundred megabytes of memory to run. And, that's kind of annoying, but, I deal with it.
Yeah, that reminds me a little bit of Jenkins. It was like, it's all this Java setup. And yeah, I remember just, fighting with it. And it's like, oh, well, you have to specify that it has more memory and all kinds of other crazy stuff instead of just saying, just run this.
Yep.
Yep. So, on a couple of smaller applications, I was initially playing around with Sumo Logic. Sumo Logic, the log applet, took up more memory than the Rails application. I'm like, that's just ridiculous. That should not ever happen.
Oh, that's crazy.
So, but I think for the most part, other than a crappy UI that they have sometimes, I'm not a huge fan of it, but I think the benefits outweigh, just instead of having to parse multiple servers, because, 3-4 servers isn't too much to manage, but if you have like 20 application servers, definitely you have to have some kind of centralized log store.
Yep.
And I think Elasticsearch has one, or whatever Elastico is now, Logstash. I haven't checked around with that too much yet, but it looks like an open source self-hosted thing that does something very similar.
Yeah, you can get different, like there's like integration with Docker and things like that too. So you can ship the container logs off to it, and then you can go through it and you can use like Kibana as your dashboard to pull the data out of it and things like that. And again, it's one of those things where if you've got time and you've got resources and you can make that a priority to kind of roll your own, that's cool. Then probably would be beneficial. If you don't, just know that it's not necessarily an easy process to get all that up and running. It's time consuming, and there's a few hurdles you'll run into.
So one thing that I'm wondering about is, it seems like there are a lot of places where we can get good information about the errors that we're running into, but what if there's not? Like, what if there isn't great information? For example, I just listened to the episode we did with Peter Bott Harkins about some of the race conditions and stuff, and you can't always, like, the information isn't necessarily there anymore. And so if you don't have the information, do you just have to kind of noodle it out in your head, or how do you track down that information? It's not in the log and it's not really It didn't even raise an exception, maybe.
Try to get as much information out of people as you can, and then assume that most of it is false. And that sounds really cynical, but people tend to have a pretty poor recollection of what actually happened. But if you piece together what you can see in logs and with what they're telling you, and you can use your experience, a lot of times you can get a good idea of where the problem might be going. And at that point, it is, let's look at the test that we have, or if we don't have any tests, let's look at the code, let's trace through the code, and try to logically work out how this might have happened. And I have sat with other developers on a whiteboard and just tried to trace the request through an application. Just try to, what are all the things it goes through? What are all the ways this could possibly happen, and figure it out. And it's a little bit of detective work. It's not, not just, oh yeah, the user said this is happening. There's so many times, I hate to say it, but there's so many times when the user was withholding information. Like, they double submitted or hit the back button or didn't fill anything out, or there's one application that comes to mind. A friend of mine was talking about where a previous developer had not put any validations on the model.
Y'all.
And well, the thing is the previous developer was told not to put any validations on the model because they wanted to be able to just enter whatever they needed to enter into it. And the new developer was dealing with the problem of, hey, how come when we run our reports, there's blank data? And this new developer, it took them a week to figure out the reason there's blank data is because you're putting blank data in the database. The user thought that they would just, that data would just somehow magically appear. No, you have to enter that data. And that's just, one of many stories that you can run into. So assuming the user is telling you the truth, not withholding any information, and you don't have logs, you can usually go off what they say. But I'm cynical. I've had many, many bad experiences.
The user always lies. It's a pun off of Gregory House on House MD. Love that show. But yeah, I think extracting relevant information out of the user, it really is important, especially if you're debugging something, because chances are you're not the one who came across the bug. It was reported to you. So to have the communication skills to ask the appropriate questions, to basically pull their teeth out to get, the relevant information that you need to troubleshoot the issue is really important. One of my pet peeves is someone will tell me like, hey, David, do you have time? We need to look at something. I'm like, yeah, sure. What's up? She's like, do we have a problem with this application? I'm like, no, not that I know of. And then the conversation usually goes like, well, it's broken. I'm like, oh, okay, well, I'll look into it. So I load up the application. It works. I check the previous test case runs. They all pass. So I'm like, all right, no, nothing's wrong. And I continue on with my day. A few weeks later, like, so did you ever get that issue fixed? I'm like, what issue? So, gathering relevant information is, almost as important as actually debugging the issue.
One of the things that I did long time ago was, do that whole help desk thing. You help people with their computer issues. And one of the skills that I learned when I was doing that was just observe them working. If you're lucky enough to be able to observe the people who are using your application, you can learn a lot about what issues come up. If you can say, hey, can I come watch you use the application and see if you can get that error to show up again. If you can do that, and if you're not on premises, you can still, walk them through doing a screen share with you or something like that, so you can observe them moving around the application. Sometimes the user interface isn't as clear as to the person using it as it is to the developer, and they're using or they're using it in a completely different way that was unintended, and you can't blame that on user error. A lot of times there needs to be a change made to the design to prevent that from happening or something like that. But if you're fortunate enough to be able to do that, if you can get them to cooperate and approach it with, hey, I want to help you figure this out. And the best way for me to help you figure this out is to see if we can recreate this together. So we can make the application give us the same error together. You as a developer can then set up any kind of logging, additional logging, or whatever traps you need to do to pull more data. And then you can watch how they interact with the application, and you can pull all that information together. And if it happens again, you're in business. And that has been successful for me. That approach has worked for me in most cases where I've employed it. Sometimes I will encounter the occasional person who's just, they don't have time, they're too busy. You fix it, you're the developer. But that's not as common, and I don't recommend going in with the attitude of, they're just going to blow me off. I really do try to go at it with, hey, I want to help you solve this. Let's work on this together. You have some time for us to try to solve this together, and people are pretty receptive to that.
Yeah, and getting access to the production data, is also, I'd never try to troubleshoot in the production environment. If there is a production issue, I'll pull down the production database into my own local testing environment and then try to debug it from there, because I definitely don't want to change around customer data. And if I'm able to recreate the error that they described within there, then I know that I probably have a application issue. Otherwise, it could be a environment issue, which could, refer back to a caching issue or something like that.
I want to just ask, you're saying you're taking the production data and bringing it down to a local development environment. Do you have any cautionary words for developers who might do that and then take their laptop home with all that data on it?
Well, one, if you have a laptop or even a desktop, it should be encrypted. There is with solid state speeds and hardware AES encryption. There's no reason not to do that. Like if you're not doing that, shame on you. Unless you have a really good reason not to.
I just hear some development manager doing a spit take when they hear, let's just download the production database to your desktop machine and because I know many places where that approach would not fly. I'm thinking hospitals, things like that.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, you just have a whole laptop full of social security numbers, no big deal, right?
But, at the same time, it doesn't have to be a dump down to your local development environment, just some kind of testing or staging environment that you could have a mirror of a read-only from your production database in a controlled and secure environment that you're able to access and, kind of have free reign to do the necessary functions that you need to.
Well, and I've actually seen scripts where it basically goes, does the dump, and then before it puts it into the staging system, it actually, it goes in and sanitizes email addresses and all that stuff.
Yeah, I've seen a lot of that, those kinds of scripts. Those they don't take that long to write, and they're really, really worth the time to do.
Yeah.
I'm just trying to think if there are any other tricks that I use for this. I mean, usually it's pretty straightforward. It's just, if I'm getting really fancy, then I'll actually, pull out pry or something. But
yeah. I was troubleshooting a action cable issue the other day. I think my first step on that was to cry for about 5 minutes in a corner. And then open up the Chrome DevTools to, kind of trace back, from the end back to the code where it's getting declared. So action cable is actually kind of tricky to debug because you have so many different things, especially if your application is a bit more complicated where, the message is broadcast through a job. So you have something like Sidekick running, but then you also have your Redis channels that your action cable is communicating through. So, and then you have the client-side JavaScript and then your back-end channel logic. And so there's just so many moving parts in action cable that's really difficult. But my typical process for debugging something like that is to start at the browser level, to go in and test and make sure that on the page that I'm expecting to have a connection, do I get a connection? And then at the console level, I'll have a console of the app running. I'll try to push a message, or on another browser in incognito mode or something, I'll try to push a message where I should then receive it. Mm-hmm. And from there, if I'm not getting it, then I know that, okay, I'm successfully connected to the channel, but then something is not broadcasting. And, that's a much easier thing to troubleshoot. I think the more difficult kind of things is if you do have a complicated subscription model for authorizing a channel, to then troubleshoot why is it not even showing up or why is it not connecting and stuff like that. And most recently, I found that my application had in the publics directory created a cache of all of the JavaScripts, and which it normally does, but that was actually causing an issue when I was running my test environment because it wasn't picking up the new channels. It was just like it kind of freaked out. So I actually had to clear the assets cache that was generated to actually try to troubleshoot, and then things just kind of started working.
Yeah, it makes sense. One other trick that I use, I did remember one more thing. So a lot of times I use the tail command on my logs just to watch things go by. And then if I know specifically what I'm looking for, then I'll actually pipe that to a grep command. And so it's just tail -f, which just starts watching the log from where new appends are happening. And then, the grep command, if I know, or I just grep for exception, like the word exception. And a lot of times it'll bring that up.
That is actually a great idea. Like, I don't know why I've never thought of doing that.
Yeah.
I use grep for so many things, but just never thought about doing it for actually tailing the logs. So I'm going to retract my previous statement about writing a debugger class. And if you just create something consistent, like, if you're doing puts debugging, then you can just grep like, application error, all caps, single, single word, and then just grep for that, and then just put that in all your puts.
Yep. Now that's kind of how I do the puts debugging, is just give me some kind of key that I can use to filter down with ACK or some other tool like that.
Yep. And I used to be a systems administrator, and so that was,
Yep.
That's kind of where that trick came from. So.
Yeah, that's awesome. Yeah, I never thought of doing that.
Well, now you have. Claim it as your own idea.
I made this.
That's right. All right. Well, I know that some of us have some time constraints, so I'm going to push us over toward picks unless there's, something else that you're just dying to share.
This episode is sponsored by Hired.com. Are you searching for a new job? That can be stressful, scary, and time-consuming. Pushy recruiters try to sell you on roles you don't actually want, and the job boards make you feel like you're throwing your resume into a black hole, never to be seen again. And sometimes you go all the way through the interview process just to find out at the very end that the salary, offer, or company culture doesn't match what you're looking for. Hired is the world's most intelligent talent matching platform for full-time and contract opportunities in engineering, development, design, product management, data science, sales, and marketing. We make your job search faster, focused, and stress-free. Instead of endlessly applying to companies and hoping for the best, Hired puts you in control of when and how you connect with compelling new opportunities. After completing one simple application, top employers apply to hire you, and on Hired you receive personal interview requests and upfront salary information so you can make informed decisions about what opportunities to pursue over a condensed timeline. Hired offers access to more than 4,000 innovative employers, including big brand names like Facebook and smaller emerging startups. The size and type of company you want to connect with is totally up to you. And we help you find new opportunities in 17 major cities in North America, Europe, Asia, and Australia. Open to relocation? Let them know. Your privacy and autonomy in your job search is of utmost importance. And if you sign up today using the show's link, that's hired.com/rubyrogues, you can get double the normal hiring bonus. That's $600 instead of $300. So go check them out at hired.com/rubyrogues.
All right. Brian, why don't you start us out with picks?
Oh boy, I only have one this time, but it's a link from Ableton, and Ableton makes software for music production. They have the Ableton Live as their flagship product. They launched a website called learningmusic.ableton.com, and it's a series of interactive lessons that teach you basic concepts of music making. They cover rhythm and beats and single notes and chords and scales, and it's this incredibly well-developed interactive curriculum that will give you a head start on understanding how to make songs, how to create your first composition. And it's really neat because I'll actually show a YouTube video of a drum loop or a drum track from a song, and then below it they'll actually show how you would recreate that rhythm, and then you can do this nice comparisons. And it's one of the most interesting and well put together curriculums I've ever seen, and I hope this becomes a bit of inspiration for other people when showing. It's a lot more than reading and videos. It really is interactive, and they challenge you throughout each one of the lessons. So even if you have no interest in writing your first song or making music, I still encourage you to take a look at it from a development standpoint, because it is an incredibly cool platform, really neat implementation. And I could be wrong, but I've heard a couple people tell me that it was created using the Elm programming language on the front end. So it's also kind of interesting to me, because I'm really enjoying spending time with Elm. So I recommend everybody check that out.
Awesome. Dave, what are your picks?
So my first picks, I'm going to say Rails Panel, because that's been a really cool tool and Google Chrome extension to use. It's just a lot of fun. And then my second pick is I recently bought a power strip. Yes, a pick is a power strip. So this power strip, it's a 5-foot long power strip with 12 plugs, and I'm using it to add to my rack server to just kind of give me more space, so I'm not using up 3 plugs for a little power brick. But I got this thing from Micro Center for like $20. It has 12 plugs on it, and it's like 5 foot long. And the closest match I found at like Home Depot and stuff was like $80. So this thing was like a quarter of the price, and it's amazing.
Nice. I'm going to jump in here with a few picks. One of them is, I've mentioned on the show before, last week I was at Microsoft Build. And it's funny because a lot of people kind of have this idea about Microsoft as sort of the evil empire, the bastion of closed source software. And they've really done a lot to bring things around and be a little bit more, or a lot more, open source friendly. And so, I'm going to pick that. I also got to hang out with the guys from .NET Rocks, which is another large development podcast. And so, quick shout out to Richard and Carl. That was just fun hanging out with them as well. But yeah, overall, it was a very, very positive experience. Had a good time, enjoyed Seattle, ate some good food. And so I'm going to pick that. And then the other thing that I'm going to pick, and I'm not sure if I've mentioned this on this show, but I've started doing a ketogenic diet. And basically what it is it's low carb, high fat, so moderate protein. And so anyway, it's been kind of fun to just learn all this stuff. I've been listening to a podcast called Livin' La Vida Low Carb, and by Jimmy Moore, and that's a lot of fun. He also has a book called Keto Clarity, which explains the ketogenic diet and, goes into a whole bunch of other stuff. And so, definitely liking that. And then I wound up getting a ketone meter for my blood. And so I prick my finger every morning, twice now, once for ketones and once for blood sugar, since I'm diabetic. And I've just been monitoring things that way. But it's been really interesting to kind of take my health by the horns and really just go for it. So there are some recipes in the keto book if you're thinking about doing something like this. But yeah, they also cite a whole bunch of references of people who have better controlled or even stopped having to take medication for diabetes and things like that. And so I'm looking at this as kind of a long-term play toward really controlling my diabetes and controlling my health. So anyway, that's something that I'm playing with. And then finally, I've had ads run. In fact, I need to make sure that it doesn't go out in any more episodes. But I was going to do a Ruby Remote Conf in June, and I just couldn't pull together enough speakers that I was excited to have. We had some of whom are actually on this panel, but not enough. So what I've decided to do is I'm actually going to postpone the conference, and instead of doing a 2-day conference, I'm going to do it more of a summit style. And so if you're interested in this, if you go to rubyremoteconf.com, I'm just going to forward that over to rubydevsummit.com. And we're going to do like 10 days. I'm going to bring in a whole bunch of people. I'm just going to invite people that I want to hear from. Anyway, it's going to be a terrific conference. It should be really fun just to see what all we have there. If you have thoughts about topics that you would like to hear, then join the mailing list, because I'm going to email out a survey for this. And then if you go to rubydevsummit.com/survey, it'll also take you to that survey. So anyway, we're going to pull this together probably in October. It'll be free, and then you can pay to have access to the videos after the conference. So that's kind of the way that we're looking at doing this now. So yeah, if you're interested in any of that, then check it out. And I guess with that, we'll go ahead and wrap this up, and we'll catch everyone next week.
See you later.
Take care, everybody.
Bandwidth for this segment is provided by CacheFly, the world's fastest CDN. Deliver your content fast with CacheFly. Visit CACHEFLY.com to learn more.